And what we would really love to do now is have my three colleagues join me on stage. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, research fellow at the Hoover Institution and Stanford University, and founder of the AHA Foundation. Delano Squires, a writer for The Blaze, The Federalist, and the Woodson Center 1776 Unites. And Kmele Foster, co-host of the Fifth Column podcast and the co-founder of the media company Freethink. After 3 days, we've had incredible messages and data, but now it's time to ask the question, what is next? How do we move forward? How do we pass the torch to the new generation? And with that, Ayaan, I will begin with you.
Well, Ian, thank you. Thank you very much. I am going to start by asking us to imagine two scenarios. And both scenarios are in the year 2062. So that is exactly 40 years from now, where here it is 40 years on from the Fairmont Conference. So 40 years from now, it's 2062. We're hosted by Sarah Crowe, Old Parkland 2.0, and Ian Rowe Jr. opens
Oscar
and then we reflect on this one and we say, don't you remember, those of us who are spared, don't you remember that amazing, amazing conference that we went to, that sensational claim made by Shelby Steele that the black man is free, we're not oppressed. We remember Glenn Lowry, that guy who said, I'll go down swinging. And we remember, again, Clarence Thomas, who I would say is probably the only major black figure in an institution that fights for what this conference talked about. And in a nutshell, what the Fairmont Conference and this conference, in a nutshell, what it is about is for the black man to have the courage to live free. The beautiful words used by Shelby Steele that we all believe in. So 40 years on, we look back and we say, we shake our heads sadly, and we say, we don't know what happened. We had all these fantastic people, but all those problems that we talked about, the broken family, the crime, these terrible people who campaign for dependency, they've won. The problems are only bigger now. Sadly, I wasn't here in 1982, but listening to everyone who was at the Fairmont Conference, I kept asking myself, so 40 years on, the problems that they talked about back then in that memorable conference are bigger today? That's one scenario. The other scenario is this one. It's 2062, same setting. We come together and we say, we won. We went and we fought them. We fought them on YouTube and we fought them on TikTok. We fought them on Twitter and we fought them on Instagram. We fought them on cable TV and we fought them on the op-ed pages. We fought them on the stage and we fought them on the stadium. We fought them in the boardrooms and in the courts. We fought them in kindergarten and in colleges. We fought them in Congress and in the Oval Office. We fought them in the states and we fought them in the city councils. We fought them in philanthropic foundations and think tanks. We fought them in the festivals of music and art. We fought them when they had marches and protests. We had those too. We fought them everywhere. They were nasty, they were violent, they were mendacious. We were poised, we were dignified, we were polite, but we were firm. And we won. Sorry, I was just channeling my inner Churchill. Now you have to say, who are they? Who are we fighting? And my takeaway from this conference is encapsulated again in those two people we saw in that video that some of you may not have seen. It's Bobo and it's Gay. It's Al Sharpton and it's Jesse Jackson. It's Patrisse Cullors of BLM and it's Kamala Harris. And what do these people have in common? What they have in common is a rejection of what Shelby Steele said. They reject the notion that the black man is free. As black people in America, we are free. They reject that notion. And not only do they reject it, they profit from it. And so our new enemy is not the guy in the plantation who is whipping us. It's Bobo and it's Gay. And we have to take the fight to them. Now, how are we going to do that? How are we going to leave here tomorrow and then make sure we see each other before it's 40 years?
Oh, yes.
That means we have to build a movement, and the movement will be centered around that notion of the courage to live free. That is the message we are selling. And we're going to have to sell it through all of those battlefields, big and small. But to build a movement, you have to be enterprising. And to be enterprising, you have to meet and meet and meet again. Not in 40 years, but on Monday. You have to write a business plan, draw up an org chart, raise money, develop goals and timelines. You have to establish a discipline of periodic quarterly reports. We have to celebrate small successes, big successes and victories, and we have to overcome obstacles. And right now, the biggest obstacle was put into words by the judge there, who said, we're up against a wall of deceit. We have to overcome that wall of deceit. And some of it is self-deception, and a lot of it is people who share a skin color and a history with us, who are mining the misery of slavery and of Jim Crow to benefit for themselves only, who are prepared to keep black people down so that they can live a life in comfort, but a life of dependency. Because Bobo and Gay may be comfortable, they may be in Harvard and they may be in Yale and they may be in Oval Office or wherever, but they're still dependent. So to do that, to build that movement, we need to realize that we can't just meet every 40 years. We have to get our hands dirty. We have to get into it. I want to continue. I want to be a part of it. I'm prepared to be with you on Monday. And I think I know that some of my friends and fellow mates in this mission have figured some of this out, at least fast steps.
Ayaan, actually, our meeting is tomorrow.
Yes. Yes, thank you.
Yes. Thank you for that battle plan. I mean, Kmele, 42 years ago when Thomas Sowell organized the Fairmont Conference, it was actually news that there were a group of black conservatives actually meeting in the same place. Today, actually, because of progress, this is not such an anomaly. But what is an anomaly is that our messages don't seem to be on the platforms that reach most people. And so part of the question is, how do we either infiltrate some of these existing institutions that are sending a lot of these messages, or do we build our own? I'm building a new network of schools. We need to build a whole host of institutions, but how do you think about that in the creation or the infiltration? And obviously it's both, but How should we be thinking about that?
Yeah, well, as a starting point, I just want to first start by thanking you and the organizers of the conference for including me in this conversation. There really is a diversity of perspectives represented here, and I think all under the banner of, and I'll define this in my own terms, but I think they work for most of the courageous people I've met here this weekend, a respect for the dignity of the individual, an appreciation for the need to empower people, and a determination to help people do good, to better themselves and to improve the state of their lives. And it is, I think one of the things that I observe when I think about media and I talk to people about media is I encounter a great deal of pessimism and cynicism, a belief that the vestigial elite media organizations generally, they reflect a kind of monoculture. You don't see or hear a number of perspectives there that might be reflected in this particular room. And honestly, and I think perhaps a bit jarringly for many of us, over the course of the last 3 years, it's become even less common to encounter those voices and those sentiments in those contexts. But I think it's very important to actually think about what the media landscape actually looks like, and the degree to which you can both establish new media properties at a cost and at a scale that is astonishing relative to what it would have cost you before to, say, launch a radio station 80 years ago, to launch a television network 40 years ago. Today, the proliferation of podcasts, of news periodicals that exist on Substack exclusively, and the reach of those publications is quite astonishing. And the fact of the matter is that there are plenty of ways to reach audiences with messages that resonate with them. And there are plenty of conservatives that are thriving online, the Daily Wires of the world. So it's important to keep that in mind, because I fear that being overly cynical about, or overly pessimistic and cynical about the opportunities to have conversations with people and to make arguments blunts efforts to persuade and leads people to focus narrowly on kind of political opportunism, on kind of the lowest common denominator arguments, on caricaturing the people with whom they have severe, substantial disagreements, oftentimes because they are being routinely caricatured. But I believe firmly that the arguments that are likely to be the most durable, and certainly the ones that are likely to be the most persuasive, are arguments that are well-founded and based on your own principles and values, where you're looking to complicate established narratives, where you're finding common ground and engaging in meaningful discourse with people of a bunch of different divergent perspectives. There is a real opportunity to do that, and it is certainly possible to attain virality and to have some sort of cultural influence by seeking out the fight, by focusing on the worst possible articulations of the bad ideas that you disagree with and want to contend with. But I'd argue that there's plenty of people doing that work. And there are far too few people that are willing to do meaningful bridge building, that are willing to talk about issues in a way that is going to resonate with people who disagree with them in a profound way, and that is going to redefine the terms of old, stale, stultified debates. I'd submit to you that one of the things I find most distressing is the way that the culture war has become kind of such a dominant aspect of our politics and our society and our engagement with people. And I think there's a real opportunity to circumvent a lot of those debates, to find avenues to focus on what actually matters. I think pursuing, as I've mentioned a few times in different contexts, pursuing and focusing narrowly on disparities comes at an expense, it comes at a cost. We are oftentimes doing that, and it's to our disservice because we're not focusing on the actual deprivations. And there are plenty of material problems. One of the first things I can remember hearing Ian talk about is the need for profound educational reform. The fact that so many schools are in fact failing at helping to build or bring about critical thinkers, that literacy rates have been stale, and in some cases, not stale, but stagnant, and in some cases falling for a very long time in a number of institutions. And unfortunately, most Americans are engaged, to the extent they're engaged in conversations about education, you would believe that the most important argument is whether or not someone is kind of trying to do some sort of political indoctrination inside of a school. And I'd argue that that may be important, but it's also pretty important that children actually be able to read and be able to engage in critical thinking. And to the extent that you're kind of wrestling over a carcass, something that doesn't work very well, that is already underserving students, classrooms that don't inspire them to do more, there's a sense in which there's a wasted effort and a wasted opportunity and a missed opportunity to take the genuine moral high ground and to focus on what actually matters. So I'll stop there.
No, thank you. Delano, you have done a tremendous amount of work around talking about the importance of family structure. You know, Kmele has just shared with us in Ayaan's battle plan that there are a lot more platforms for us to send a more empowering message, particularly to young people. And yet we know, if you look at the data from 2019 in terms of non-marital births, for women 24 and under, the non-marital birth rate for all women was 71%. It was actually 61% in the white community. It was 91% in the black community.
Yeah.
What is the message we need to send to young people who are making that decision with almost certainty of knowing that that life choice will likely put them in a much more risky position in terms of their own life and their own child?
I mean, that is the question that I think we've been trying to answer, I'd say, for the better part of 50, 60 years. I'm glad that you talked about the general data first, because, you know, I think about the schoolyard rhyme that we used to have, right? It'd be a boy and a girl, you know, Chris and Christina sitting in the tree, Kissing, first comes love, then comes
marriage,
then comes baby and the baby.
Carriage.
So what we have now in our society across the board, but particularly in the African American community, is Chris and Christina staring at their screens, Texting. First comes sex, then comes baby, then comes marriage, but that's a big maybe.
That's a big maybe.
So, so part of it is to name the phenomenon. And to understand, and to your point, that this goes across the board in terms of ethnic groups. But the reason that I often write about the black family specifically is because no other group's conversations about family breakdown start in slavery. And I know that those conversations are dishonest, because coming out of emancipation, one of the first things that black people did was begin to reconstitute their families. And that's why, you know, early on in the 20th century, black men and women were at one point more likely to be married than their white peers. So what we're talking about didn't really start until, you know, late 60s. We talked about the Moynihan Report and, you know, macroeconomic changes and big changes in culture, sexual revolution, so on and so on and so forth. But some of that was policy. And some of those decisions were intentional, and I think the conversations around policy, we need to understand, oftentimes we think about, you know, we start with intent, but there are 5 eyes, at least for me, to assess policy. There's intent, there's incentives, there are interests, there's implementation, and then there's impact. We barely even get to impact, because what we do is we start with intent, see that it doesn't work, and then say, well, we really had a different intention. So when it comes to marriage and family, again, I believe in naming the phenomenon, understanding that policy can only go but so far. Part of the problem is that every American's orientation towards government, I think, is completely off kilter. The founders set up, their founding documents were about the protection of rights. We primarily think of government as the provision of resources. So we've taken what used to be Uncle Sam, and we've put him in the master bedroom. Now he's everybody's father. And as a man whose primary vocations are husband and father, I resent that. So he has to go.
Yes.
Right? I'll talk about one other group and then talk specifically about how we move forward. The other group, and this is sad to say, and I know Jason Riley's written about this, I've written about it, a lot of people have written about it. Whenever President Obama talked about the importance of marriage and family publicly as it related to improved outcomes in the black community, you know who the only people who would criticize him? The ones on his left. It was the Melissa Harris Perrys. It was people who wrote for Essence. It was
Jesse Jackson.
Jesse Jackson. It was Michael Eric Dyson. I actually have a name for this. I call it Dyson dichotomy. In 2014, when Melissa Harris Perry had her show on MSNBC, she had a roundtable panel. They talked about the myth of the magical black daddy. And they really, people were making the argument that black fathers matter, marriage matters. They made that into a caricature that, oh, black dads are magical. And that's not what anyone was saying. So you had Michael Eric Dyson, who was a part of that. As a husband and father himself, I found that to be despicable, quite honest. Then 2 years later, he shows up on Tucker Carlson. And to that audience, he argued for reparations accounts that white people would fund for black people. So here you have a black man who, you go from Cornel West, I'd say that Dyson inherited his mantle, then to Coates, then to Kendi. I'm gonna come to Kendi. But Dyson, when talking to white liberals, undermines the value of the family. But talking to white conservatives said, pay up. These people have to be moved out of the way.
Yeah, they have to be exposed.
They have to be.
Yeah.
And Kendi, again, who is last in that line, I see him and his equity agenda. And every time you hear equity in the classroom, in the schoolhouse, in the police precinct, it always means black folk are about to get the shaft. Always. Ibram Kendi is a thief. He is stealing my dignity and my honor by telling me that I have to put my hope in a white savior. So as it relates to the family, here's what I would recommend. I think what we need is a national campaign to reinvigorate sort of the importance, the primacy, the centrality of what I call the natural family. People call it the nuclear family. I call it the natural family. One man, one woman, one lifetime, one covenantal union, committed to one another and their offspring that they raise together. And really quick, how we do that, it could be a collaboration of different think tanks. That would include, grassroots organizations like what Bob Woodson was talking about. I first started writing publicly for a site called Black and Married with Kids to a couple that wanted to create, more positive images of black families. They had their website, they had resources, they did documentaries, they did cruises. I actually met my lovely wife at their third documentary. So it is going to take different parts of the body doing different things. But what I would do, I would take that to every organization that says that is fighting on behalf of black people, and I would say, do you support what we're doing? And hopefully most of them would say yes. But if the NAACP, which they will, because again, I'm focusing on the natural family, they're gonna say, what about, same-sex couples and so on and so on and so forth. And I said, look, somebody can handle all that. I'm focusing here. I want to be able to go into the public square and say, look, the NAACP that says that they're fighting for colored people is not fighting for the black family. What they're doing, they go to Hollywood and they get C-list actors to take responsibility for racism. So they think that white folks have more responsibility for racism than I do for my own family. And as I said, that type of mindset has to be dealt with directly. And thankfully, I'm just a man to do it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
One of them.
Yes.
One of them.
Before we go to questions, I do want to ask the three of you, because everything that we're saying is so compelling, it's almost obvious. We have the courage to speak obvious truths. And yet, with one incident of a Michael Brown or one incident of a George Floyd, the nation's attention is just fixed somewhere else. How do we combat that? Are there the equivalents of those events that we can capture the national attention that says this is embodiment of what we actually all stand for as Americans, not just Black Americans?
Yeah.
So we wait. What happens is they have an infrastructure and they wait for the crisis to happen and they never let a crisis go to waste. We don't have an infrastructure. And I think once we get going and we have that infrastructure, we start it. I think instead of manufacturing outrage, we express outrage at the things that are already happening. We should stop talking about Black on Black homicide only in terms of statistics. Statistics matter. But those children who are killed have names.
Yes,
Yes.
they
And
do.
if we want to go and, if they can do the protest thing, I can do the protest thing. But now I want to go and actually protest for that little kid who was going to school and who got shot.
And we'd be doing it much more frequently than these one-off.
Yeah, we can do it every day because it happens every
Unfortunately.
day multiple times. I think we all agree on the fact that our ideas, our vision is superior to that of Bobo and Gay.
Yes.
They have the infrastructure, and to get to the question that we discussed, Ian, before, while we were moving, it was, what can we learn from them? I know that their ideas are despisable, but there's a lot that we can learn from them. When it comes to the infiltrating of organizations and institutions, I'm not sure that we need to infiltrate. We already have people in there. There are people who agree with us in each and every one of these institutions, but we simply haven't activated them. We haven't handed them these ready-made narratives, these ready-made slogans, these ready-made stickers, the yardsticks. That's kind of the thing. They keep the problem going and going and going and going and build it out of proportion. There is racism in America, but if you look at what they're doing, you will think that the place is just creeping and crawling with racists, that it's more prevalent than the COVID virus. What we need to be doing is to say, actually, there are more people who are Black who have the courage to lead free lives, but how do we translate that into that bumper sticker type of thing, the slogan, the narrative, and then keep doing it?
I think it's worth contemplating the scarcity of actual kind of political action and like federal action related to, say, the death of George Floyd. There hasn't been any national legislation with respect to police reform. And it's worth noting that while you can activate people's concern and animate a panic and garner a great deal of attention and perhaps even make certain slogans very popular and get them brandished on particular streets, the actual hard work of enduring social change requires something a lot more deliberate and thoughtful. And it requires, I think, a better understanding of your own values. And the one thing I would also suggest is that there is often a tendency to kind of lean on the authority of MLK or to talk about the founders and the framers and to restate old valuable ideas in the same way. And I think there's a reluctance perhaps to actually innovate there, to ask for more. I think there are certain things that I will hear, like colorblindness, for example, as an aspiration. And while I respect and admire a number of the people who I hear talking about that as an aspiration, it's worth acknowledging that colorblindness is a defect. You're ignoring something. This isn't something that you aspire to. So what is the value that we're actually aspiring to, that you're offering as an alternative to the perspective of someone who is talking about racial equity?
Yep.
I have perspectives on this, But if we're not wrestling with those questions publicly, I think you risk being defined by your opponents as someone who's simply defending the status quo, and that is an undesirable circumstance.
Yeah.
And perhaps our aspiration is to focus on the content of each person's character.
Yeah.
Perhaps that might be an idea. Let me open it up for questions. Go to John and then Charles.
Thank you. I deeply resonate with the sentiments expressed on this panel and just commend you, Ian, and the organizers for convening this entire conference and this conversation in particular. I think it elevates us to a higher perspective in terms of the approach that's needed for us to sort of build the bridges that can allow us to take the field in victory, right? I do want to raise the name of Martin Luther King Jr. Once more here, and Kmele, since you've invoked him, to make reference a bit to King's philosophical legacy and see how you see it as applying here. You know, Dr. King was fiercely opposed by, naturally, you know, the forces of segregation and white racism in American society, white supremacy and so forth. But he was also very much opposed by black militants and those who felt that his means were too accommodationist. But in each direction, Dr. King was intent upon humanizing his opposition. He had deep, deep disagreements with Stokely Carmichael, but was deliberate in articulating his strong understanding of where the anger of the Black Power the Black Power movement came from, his understanding of their deep frustrations with the limits of the success of the nonviolent movement, before mincing no words and articulating his firm belief in the idea that Black Power nationalism was destructive to the ultimate goals of the beloved community. And he said that he loved George Wallace. He added that, I didn't say I liked him, you know, that he was very glad that the good Lord didn't say to like your enemy, because he could not like a man who denied his humanity and would do him evil, but nevertheless, that he loved him as a creature of God. And that the vision of the beloved community, of course, was that we all would be reconciled to each other in an inclusive community in which our rights were respected and our human dignity established. And so I guess my question here is, Dr. King's philosophy of nonviolence, this perspective that says dignify the humanity even in those who most fiercely disagree with you, is that obsolete? Do we put that aside? Or as much as we worship the iconography of King, can we go deeper in resuscitating and reviving that spiritual substance of a philosophy of social change in a way that can inform the quest that we are all on, to make this a society in which we are truly out of many one?
Sure. I think that's a great question. I'm glad Professor Frisbee, if I have his name correct, brought up, he talked about the 10 Commandments and he sort of pressed into the spiritual dimension of some of these conversations. I think we need more of that. As I said yesterday, even in terms of gun violence, the conversation is always about what resources people who shoot people don't have, not the fact that shooting people is the wrong thing to do. So again, I talked about Ibram Kendi. To give him credit, I think he's the most effective evangelist in this country. He takes his worldview, racism is death, anti-racism is life, and he takes that through every single institution in this country. He is the reason that your child's school is sending home, talking about anti-racist education and so on and so on and so forth. So me as a Christian, to be quite frank, I figure if he's in the public square peddling his false gospel, I can at least show up and talk about the real thing. So I do think there's something to be learned from Dr. King's lesson, but I caution us from framing the conversation from the perspective of a 1964 world, right? That was a Model T world. We're in a Tesla world. So where that comes up, and I'll be really brief, it comes up in issues that don't even have to do with race necessarily.
Yeah.
We're at a point where we're questioning what is a man and what is a woman. That's a Genesis 1:27 issue. Right? So, and I think this may get to something, that I think Kmele often argues for, which is as we move forward and the specter of systemic racism, right, outward racial antagonism starts to subside, all of us are going to be in the same boat dealing with these issues. If we don't change this now, and again, part of what I would say is to argue I argue from a biblical worldview, then in 40 years, our grandchildren will be talking about birthing people.
Yeah.
Now, I'm raising my grandchildren's parents today. I have 3 young children. If I don't keep that out of the house as a watchman, then I'm going to fail at my job. So to the extent that I draw on King's message and his legacy, I draw on it to say, if we address racism using a biblical worldview, using scripture in the 60s, there's no reason why I can't bring faith into the public square in the 2020s.
I'd like to say just a brief word for pluralism, which I think is a value in a classical liberal society and a constitutional republic. I'm not an evangelical. I don't share the same sensibilities as perhaps many of you do about things like traditional marriage, about trans issues, for example. I worry about a circumstance where we're simply trying to seize control of public institutions and have a kind of ideological duel about who will get to teach their particular set of beliefs here. There is another way. I think the goal of, say, a liberal education in a free society probably ought to be to foster critical thinking and to figure out how we can live together with our several differences. That is the goal and the aspiration, not to dominate with our worldview because we are so certain that it is right, but to genuinely preserve the principles of a free society, which means that there will always be new fashions and flavors and ideas that have to be contended with. And 50 years from now, I am confident there are going to be new trends and fashions that I dislike emphatically, but nevertheless will win for at least a short period of time. I don't much like Black History Month. I don't like my children being raced. I know that I can't ban that out of existence. I have to contend with it as it is, but I'm willing to do the hard work of contending with that. And I just think it's relative. I think it's intensely important that we keep those values in mind in the midst of having a rather intense kind of cultural clash about ideas in the public square.
Yes.
Yeah.
Charles.
I know I need to be quick, 40 seconds. You know what I'm going to say because I've been beating this drum nonstop and I probably said it to all of you individually. But as we talk about the takeaway and leading to the win that Ayaan's talking about, we have to find a way to take all these great ideas and take them to what I call the 200 million people who don't follow social media, who aren't listening to Fox News or CNN, and people who are not elites, but they are far removed from poverty, right? So they don't have people in their circles who are struggling with some of the things we're trying to fix. And no one's talking to them. And they get a vote, and it's more of them than any of us. So we need to think of ways, we can't solve it now, but think of ways that we can reach those people.
Charles, you are part of the collective working group of this entire room who's figuring out the next steps to do just that. We're gonna have the final question from Bob Woodson.
You hear me? I really think deep in the DNA of this country is a desire to reward virtue. We see it when a homeless man in Boston at age 46 turns in a knapsack with $45,000, and they do a GoFundMe, and they raise $93,000 in 3 days for him. And that has been repeated around. So there's deep in our DNA a reward to do that. The challenge is we need to come up with more creative ways to take the experiences of the panel that you heard today, that within the community suffering the problem, there are dramatic examples like you heard today. The challenge is, how can we take some of their experiences and project them in a way so that they begin to have the same impact of going viral? But we first must commit to doing that and honoring that and seeing the value in these indigenous experiences. I mean, every day I hear some dramatic examples of restoration and redemption that are just mind-boggling. And we need to have more credible messengers. And so I think the challenge for you young people is to sit with people who know how to penetrate the media and come up with short-term and ways of expressing some of these profound truths, and give Americans a chance to vote for virtue, but give it to them in a way that they can understand it and respond to it.
Thank you, Bob.
Ian, can I say something really quick?
Very fast.
Very fast. Two points. One, I think to Charles's point, I love the idea of a barbershop revolution where black men who have some of these ideas are able to talk to other men, their peers, not to say vote Republican, but to say, hey, we have common values, right? Let's talk about our values first before we talk about our votes. And then to Bob's point, one of the things that was clearly evident but didn't get called out is that 3 of his 4 grassroots leaders operate in the South. So much of the attention around the plight of Black America is centered on large cities. I'm a New Yorker, I went to school in Pittsburgh, I live outside of DC. I think we need more attention on places outside of DC, Philadelphia, Baltimore, New Orleans, and Atlanta. I'm not saying those stories aren't important, but there's a lot of work that's going on that doesn't get covered by the New York Times and the Washington Post. So I think that we need to press into that, to Bob's point, so that we can see what grassroots leadership looks like outside of the I-95 corridor.
Yes. Well, please join me in thanking this incredible panel.
We got to talk tomorrow.